intensive agriculture, crop production, and then specifically as we get into this, what heirloom seeds are and how we're trying to protect the diversity of those seeds, and then what GMO, genetically modified organisms are, and of course you start by modifying the seed. All right, introduction, I think we covered that. Okay, so if in industrial crop production, this all started because we wanted to get high yields. But we now know that the problem with that is we have high input, right? We have to put in pesticides, chemical fertilizers, lots of energy to run the tractors. And so that drove us towards one of the industrialized agriculture problems, which is monocultures, okay? Guys must be able to answer this. And we mostly monoculture things that are really important, especially the staples, okay? So just a reminder, the staples are things like corn, rice, and wheat. Basically, in a certain region of the world, for example, let's pick Asia, their whole diet is based mostly off rice, right? If they can get protein from fish and all that kind of stuff, that's really an extra positive, an extra, kind of almost a bonus, okay? Then the other kind of monoculture, very similar, or industrial agriculture, was plantation agriculture. This is where we went ahead and said, okay, we're going to plant this almost in like a plantation. Think back to cotton plantations, right, where they just grew cotton. And these are mostly for cash crops like timber. So like in South Africa, I told you, we grow pine trees and eucalyptus trees in plantations because we don't have the big natural forests that you have here in the United States. Things like bananas, soybeans, sugarcane, coffee, palm oil. In Costa Rica, when we're down there, we see them cutting natural forests to put in palm oil. What do you call it? What's palm trees that specifically produce palm oil, and then also vegetables. So that's kind of a plantation type thing where you focus on one thing, and vegetables would be the Coachella Valley below Palm Springs. And mostly this kind of agriculture is focused in less developed countries. Then the other way the industrial agriculture really upped the ante in terms of production was a lot of greenhouses and the use of greenhouses, and that's very common if you go halfway down Baja, Mexico. And then also things like intensification through hydroponics, where we bring the water and the nutrients right to the plant. The roots don't even really have to go and find it. That's normally grown indoors. Okay. Just a reminder, this is in contrast to traditional agriculture, which would be low input systems, right? And that's where we do polyculture. We talked about the three sisters: beans, corn, and what was the other sister? I always forget the other sister. Beans, corn, and in traditional Native American, what's the third sister, guys? I think it was their base: beans, corn, and they all grew together. Come on, somebody help me out. We've gone over this already. Squash. Thank you. All right. Turn you up a little bit. Was that Mrs. Pike, or who was that?
Enrique.
All right. Good. All right. I couldn't hear you too well, so I'll put that up. Okay. All right, and then slash and burn agriculture. This is the old rainforest story and other places where we have subsistence agriculture in tropical forests. We clear and burn a small plot. We grow crops there as long as the nutrients last, but they leach through the soil very quickly. We get a lot of soil erosion. I showed you some pictures of this in Costa Rica earlier in the semester. Traditional agriculture often relies on low input polycultures. So there is a mix. What this lecture is pointing to is we can still be intensive, but we can be more sustainable. And so This is where we have areas that have traditional subsistence agriculture. Okay, so this would be in places like Thailand, China, parts of Japan, where they've grown for years, they've intensively grown crops, let's say rice, but it's intensive, but it's still subsistence. It's very low input. They use human labor and draft animals to grow the family food and a little bit more. Okay, and then there's a traditional intensive agriculture. Okay, this goes all the way back to the Spanish Americans. Here in the United States, they brought in irrigation to make the agriculture more intensive, to be higher production through irrigation. Okay. World's types of food production. We have seen this slide before, right, guys? Yes, no? Yeah. Okay. So if you look at that, you can see where industrialized agriculture is. It's mostly in the first world, United States, South America, Australia, South Africa, across Asia. Then you can see shifting cultivation. And then you can see nomads and herding, which we pointed out when we looked at soil erosion and desertification. That's where we see these problems with desertification, because they're nomads herding their cattle, and they tend to have a problem with, and I saw this in South Africa when I was here the last time, with what's called the tragedy of the commons, right? Where everyone uses as much of the grazing as they can get away with, rather than everyone managing it, right? And so that causes overgrazing, and then that increases, one of the reasons for increasing desertification. So across the top of Africa there, up near the Sahara, is one of the worst places for that. Okay. Closer look at industrialized agriculture, looking back at the history of this. In the 1950s, we talked about, they refer to the first green revolution. And that was because we did monocultures. We had high inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, and water, and we did multiple cropping. So in the Midwest, I had a friend who just worked a few years in Kentucky. They'll do corn, and then they'll do soybean, all in the same year. So you're using the land very intensively. And that's sped up since 1967, where we now started to use selective breeding. Okay, so remember this class, we need to know the difference between selective breeding and GMOs. Genetically modified organisms, we go in and actually change the genetics, the genes physically. Okay. Selective breeding, we change it through breeding. We breed the best to the best. So we have a certain kind of dwarf variety of rice, for example, which is one of the examples. And we breed that to another dwarf variety with very high production. Produces a lot of rice. And that's selective breeding. And that was part of what we call this first green revolution. Okay? So there was high inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation of water, but there was also selective breeding. So we looked at this before. Grain production went up, wheat, corn, and rice. But if you look over on the right, and I guess I have to be telling you which, I forgot to keep up with you with slides. So we're on a slide now, guys, about 7 or 8 in, where it says grain production at the top, and there's two graphs, one on the left, one on the right. The one on the left is called total world grain production, and the one on the right is world grain production per capita. And we'll see the one on the right is the one we want to look at, because per person, the amount of wheat, corn, and rice is stayed the same, or now is actually starting to go down. So, so we've done all these things. We've basically overused our resources, but we still haven't solved the problem, basically, of world hunger, because there's still people that aren't getting enough of these basic staples. Okay? And then the next two slides are those two slides those two graphs on separate pages. Then the next thing is, the next heading that you should go to, because this is where we really get into it, is what is sustainable crop production? Okay? So again, redefining sustainability. We need agricultural practices. Sorry, I'm turning that down. We need agricultural practices that are economically viable, meet human needs, which is social, and they're environmentally positive, right? We cannot keep on the same route of agriculture being one of the main reasons that we're not looking at a sustainable future, okay? And they can be achieved in a number of different ways. So how about we do questions here? Can anybody give me some examples of sustainable practices that we've already learned about? Give me one. What's a sustainable practice when it comes to irrigation?
Irrigation?
I don't know why I'm not picking you up very well. Let's try that. Okay, how about now?
What else? What you call it?
There's a lot of irrigation going on.
Yeah, what's a sustainable practice with irrigation?
What is he? We already answered. No, he didn't hear it. Oh, drip irrigation.
Thank you. Perfect. All right. All right. So what's a sustainable practice to do with not using as much pesticides?
What is that?
Integrated pest management.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. What is a sustainable practice when it comes to seeds? What should we do if we want to be more sustainable with our seed stock?
Heirloom seeds, right?
Thank you. Thank you. So heirloom seeds, real quick. Did anybody miss this? I don't know if we've gone over this much, but basically heirloom seeds are seeds that are heirloom. They're from a long time ago. And we preserve those. And we saw in the video you guys started to watch yesterday where they save those and grow them out and bring them forward because, you know, for example, they might not be the highest producing. Our culture, industrial agriculture, went to the highest producing. And so that first part of the video shows where, you know, there were X number of tomato seeds used in tomato production, let's say 200. Now there's 5 that are commercially used. So we go back and we rediscover those seeds. We start multiplying them so they are then commercially available so that people can go back to them because that particular seed of tomato might be resistant to, let's say, the tomato worm, right? Whereas the new one isn't. So there's huge advantage. Most likely tastes better, okay? And so we have to have this diversity, and that's one of the practices then is seed saving and specifically heirloom seeds, okay? And maybe also not such a focus on GMO seeds. Okay. All right. So history. Not quite sure we went from there to there. But again, why do we need to be sustainable? Because we feel like several cultures before us, probably the Mayans and other cultures, collapsed because their food systems collapsed. Okay, and we need to be more sustainable because we can't afford to have our food system collapse. And also we need to have, the other big issue we've talked about here, guys, was distribution. It's great to have industrialized agriculture in the United States. Let's say the richest agricultural region in the country, which is right over the hill here near Bakersfield, the San Joaquin Valley. But it's no good if we can't distribute the food to where the people need it, okay? In third world countries, for example. So sustainable agriculture also allows us to help those people produce their own food. So not only does it stop our whole system from collapsing because our soils are getting overused, we're wasting water, we are having some serious pest issues, but on the other hand, it also makes sure sustainable agriculture allows us to grow food in areas where the food is really needed. Okay? Positive food production has increased dramatically with industrialized agriculture. So we don't want to throw that away. So we don't want to throw the positive industrial agriculture away because what the solution is to be sustainable but still be intensive. Okay? We can't all just grow 3 corn plants and 2 tomato plants in our backyard because that's just not practical in the way our societies are set up. We still need to be intensive, but we need to be sustainable. And that can be done with any one of those practices we already talked about. Okay, so crossbreeding. Let's look at how we have been breeding better varieties. We're getting to the seed situation right now. Okay, so how did we selectively breed? Well, we crossbreed. We take 2 corn plants and we cross-pollinate them. Okay, I think I might have told you the story of when I was involved in a cross-pollination program in South Africa. It was run by a French company. And so we would crossbreed to introduce the dwarfing genes, okay? So that we already talked about, let's say in rice, where they're much smaller plants, so they don't need a lot of nutrients, they don't need as much water, but they're still very high producing. And they also don't have a problem that you have in most grains of lodging. So a big wind comes up and it pushes all the corn or the rice, knocks it over basically. Okay, and that was part of what happened and was done by a guy by the name of Norman Borlaug, who was basically out of UC Davis. And he did a lot of his work actually in Mexico and Latin America. Okay? And so this crossbreeding, intensive, not intensive, but selective breeding. So right there, crossbreeding, selective breeding, we're selecting the best of the best, and then we're crossbreeding amongst those varieties to get what we want. Okay? Sustainable intensification. So we have to also look at technologies. Most poor producers cannot afford the expensive technologies. And so we need to look at appropriate technologies for the area. So, okay, let's look at irrigation. Next week, we'll be looking at a very expensive but very efficient irrigation system. It's a big boom system that has these huge wheels and it takes a lot of energy and runs down the field, and it basically drip irrigates a whole field of alfalfa. We'll see that next week. Well, folks in sub-Saharan Africa can't afford that, but they could afford some very simple plastic tubing and some drip emitters or some little micro irrigation sprays. They're low pressure, low water use little sprays. They're like little mini spray nozzles. Okay, they could afford that, so that would allow them to be intensive, grow more crops in a smaller area, but also use an appropriate technology. Rather than a boom system of irrigation, they would use drip irrigation. That was appropriate for their situation. Okay, so that's one of the sustainability mantras is let's use the technologies appropriately. Okay, examples of sustainable intensification. Cuba did this. A lot of this was because we had sanctions on them and they had to grow their own food. Thailand is another place where they've done a lot of sustainable intensifications. They still grow a lot of food, but they do it sustainably and intensively in small areas with low inputs. Okay? Okay, so in sustainable intensification, lessons learned. So here we go. Here's what farmers must attempt to use. They should use more organic So if you're looking for test questions, here it is. Okay, so maybe that'll make sure you guys focus on this slide. So what are we going to do instead of synthetic fertilizers? We're going to use more organic manuring, more organic fertilizers. We're going to use crop rotation and crop intensification. So we're not going to grow the same crop in the same soil year after year. We're going to rotate them so that they use different nutrients. Remember, we also might rotate in a legume. So what we're going to learn when we're out at the dairy this week is they rotate several crops through there. One of them is alfalfa. And the alfalfa actually fixes nitrogen from the air into the soil. And nitrogen is one of our 3 critical soil nutrients. So the next crop comes along now has the nitrogen that it needs already in the soil. So that's how crop rotation can work. Integrated pest management, irrigation, balanced with salinity and waterlogging management. So this would be low pressure or drip irrigation. And we also want to make sure that when we do this, we know we'll get less salinization of the soil. The soil will get less salty because we have less evaporation. And another thing could happen with flood irrigation is you can have waterlogging. You can actually water too much, and you basically waterlog the roots, and you can kill the plant or inhibit its growth. And then there's the organic farming practices, which would be a bit of all of the above. We've got organic lecture will be next week. And then the crossbreeding and GMO technologies, okay? So, number 6, we definitely don't want to stop selective breeding, crossbreeding, but we also need to look at GMO technologies. And this is very controversial because GMOs are perceived to have some other problems, right? Other problems mostly could be put into 2 areas. One, they reduce genetic diversity. And then number 2, they could and are or may be causing health effects on the consumers, us in this case, right? So, but GMO technologies, and we'll have a full-on discussion in the field about this week, next week at the thing. There's places that they are needed. So one of the places that I've seen that it's needed is to grow drought-tolerant corn. That's a GMO. That's how they produced it, through GMO technology, and that would help people in Africa get their staple, which is corn. So whether it's appropriate to be used so extensively in America, you know, where I think it's corn and soybeans, they're well over 80% of the corn and soybeans that we eat are GMO, from GMO seeds. Okay, so now looking at crossbreeding and the GMO technologies together, the first gene revolution was the crossbreeding, the one we talked about with Norman Borlaug and the dwarf rice. And it's a slow process. It takes a long time to crossbreed these. You've got to crossbreed them again, because it's just random what genes you're actually going to be selecting for, right? So you cross them, you get some improvement, then you cross them again, you get more improvement. And there's a whole technique of genetics to do that. Then genetic engineering was the second gene revolution, right? And that's only really been actively in the last 15 years, actually. It's not very long at all. And that's where we actually alter the organism's DNA, the genes, okay? And they're actually transgenic organisms. And that can be done twice as fast, and there's much more change to the plant. You get a much quicker reaction on what you want from the plant, right? What we're going to look at, one specific example, we're going to look at GMO alfalfa. And why did they grow GMO alfalfa? Why did they develop GMO alfalfa? So that they could spray it with a herbicide called Roundup. Okay? Roundup is produced by Monsanto. Monsanto produced the GMO alfalfa that's resistant to their herbicide Roundup, glyphosate. And why do they do that? Well, they want the farmer now can come and spray with Roundup on his alfalfa crop when it's young, and he kills everything else except the Roundup, because the Roundup is GMO resistant, right? So now he takes care of all the weeds very simply, okay, and gets a better crop. Is that appropriate in the United States? I personally think it's very marginal. I think we've got other ways of producing high yield crops, and I don't think that we need to do that. I think that's not necessarily appropriate. Okay, so great example of results of crossbreeding is in corn, and they refer to that in that seed video. That's why I wanted you guys to watch that seed video. Corn basically started with this tiny little corn cob that was about the size of a pea. You can see it over here. It was about 19 millimeters, 2 centimeters, so that's about ½ an inch, tiny little corn cob. And there were only 8 known varieties. That was the natural corn, about 7,000 BC. So the slide I'm on right now at the top says corn changes in 9,000 years. Okay, you guys got to go already? You guys got to leave already? Okay. Still short day today, huh? Okay. Well, anyway, I'll just keep going. There's not a lot more on the slide, on the video, and then you guys can watch it later. Thanks, you guys. Take care. All right. So, keeping going here. Let's see. History of corn breeding. It's been radically altered through selective breeding. Plant hybridization. When you selectively breed, the plants are called hybrids because they're crossed between 2 different varieties. And then recently it's been used through more advanced breeding techniques like genetic engineering. So there is definitely GMO corn, and a lot of it is grown in the United States. And then is the corn that we mentioned that can withstand drought. So why do we use genetic engineering? So we produce it for things, make crops more resistant to heat and cold. So they could be frost resistant. That would be very valuable in certain areas, for example, or can grow and produce in very hot climates. We would use it to be resistant to herbicides. That would be the Roundup Ready alfalfa, Roundup Ready corn. There's a lot of Roundup Ready GMOs that are resistant. The plant itself is not killed by Roundup. It could be resistant to insects and pests and parasites, viral diseases, drought, as we talked about. And then very important these days, salty or acidic soils. We have a lot of soils that are becoming too salty or acidic to grow the regular species. Okay, so quick look at one example, which would be herbicide tolerance. And really, to be technical about the herbicide tolerance, there's three different kinds. It's not all about Monsanto and Roundup Ready. That's number one. Glyphosate tolerant. Glyphosate tolerant is another kind of herbicide tolerance that they have developed through GMO technology. The plants are glyphosate tolerant, or clearfield systems, which gives tolerance to several herbicides. Because often, also what's happening on the flip side of this, as a farmer, Roundup might not take care of all the weeds. Might have weeds that are resistant to Roundup. So in a clearfield system, it's resistant. The plant is tolerant to Roundup and some other herbicides so that you can kill more of the weeds. Okay, so why do we do it? It increases production. and it does reduce the use of herbicides. So this is a point that's often missed in this conversation is we don't want to use a lot of herbicides. There's a big case to say that glyphosate is actually one of the least damaging herbicides. That's really controversial, but a lot of people would make that case. And we want to reduce, in general, the amount of herbicides. So if we have these very herbicide-tolerant GMOs, we can do that. The amount of herbicides in general on a GMO field is going to be less than on a non-GMO field. And that depends on also how it's grown and integrated pest management and all that kind of stuff, whether that's used. Okay? GMO technology drought tolerance. So we're experiencing the loss of arable land being land that can grow crops on, right? So for example, specific example, the HVA 1 or 2 gene into wheat and maize led to an 8 times reduction in irrigation needs in an Egyptian study, okay? Egyptian study, obviously in drought conditions. So 8 times less water needed, okay? And they're also doing that in things like sorghum, okay? GMO issues and concerns, ethics. Is it ethical to do this? Are we going a little beyond ourselves and starting to act as a god now? And that's a very legitimate conversation, okay? Is crossbreeding all we really need to have? We're very sophisticated in crossbreeding or selective breeding. Then there are the human health concerns. I do know that in last year, a very comprehensive journal peer-reviewed article came out for the National Institute of Health from them saying they haven't been able to link any major health concerns to GMOs yet. I would say that that's a little bit, still a bit of a concern because GMOs haven't been around that long, and that's a very hard thing to determine anyway. And hopefully we'll have some class presentations on this subject to go into GMOs in more detail. Thank you very much.